Bill Brewer grew up in a small town in North Louisiana in a large family. He graduated from Bryan College hoping to attend LSU Medical School, but the Lord led him to a higher calling, and he enrolled at Dallas Seminary. And there he quickly got involved with a small startup church in Richardson, Texas called Richland Bible Fellowship. It was meeting in an elementary school at the time. Upon graduating from DTS in 1979, he was called as the senior pastor of that same church, now called Woodcreek Church, where he has faithfully served for 40 years. Amen. In 1993, Bill also received his Doctor of Ministry degree from Dallas Seminary. Dr. Brewer and his wife Carol have 2 grown children and 4 grandchildren. His wife Carol is here with us today, along with his daughter Becca and her 2 kids, Evelyn, who is 5, and Letty, who is 2. So would y'all mind standing and let us recognize you? We got Carol here. There we go. Bill loves golf and anything outdoors, and he is an avid fly fisherman. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Brewer to chapel today.
Thanks, Pastor Joe. This is a big honor and a privilege to be able to come down to Dallas Seminary and to speak to you. I just want to thank you for showing up on this Friday before Easter week. This is going to be a big week for all of us, and I know you have a lot on your mind, and I appreciate you coming today, and my prayer is that God will encourage your hearts. Not long ago, it doesn't feel like that long ago to me, I sat where many of you who are students are sitting. And I remember when I came to Dallas Seminary, I remember somewhere early on, I felt like God was calling me to be a pastor. I argued with God about wanting to do that for a while, but He always wins those arguments. And I remember praying, though, after I got here, that God would allow me to pastor in only a few places in my life. I just wanted to be with people over the long haul. I wanted to be there when the babies were born. I wanted to be there when I stood there and married them, or when they put their parents in the grave. And so that was kind of my desire as I worked my way through Dallas Seminary, is to, I pray that God would only allow me to be in a few places. As I won't share the rest of that story with you because Pastor Joe already did. And who gets to do that? Who gets to stay in one church for 40 years? There aren't many. And it has been a tremendous blessing for me and for my family. But it's not always been easy. There was one time when I almost got fired. There were a few times, more than once, when I wanted to get fired or I wanted to quit. I wanted to walk away, and God said no to that. But I share this part of the story, my story, with you because I'm finishing a race that many of you are starting. I know some of you are staff and faculty here today, and so you're already in it with me, but there are many of you that are here to prepare. And I'm finishing a race that you are beginning. Growing up, I played sports. I love sports, and I've always loved them. And back in high school, where I grew up, there were only 4 sports: basketball, football, baseball, and track. That was it. And in track, I really wasn't a runner. I was a high jumper and a pole vaulter. But I'll never forget my first race. The quarter miler on our track team got sick right before his race. And the coach came over to the team and said, does anybody want to volunteer to run his race in his place? And I thought to myself, hey, I'm fast. I can do this. In fact, I want to show them what a stud I am. And so I volunteered. And the gun, the starter, fires the gun, and I take out of the starting blocks at a dead run, running as fast as I can into the first turn, got into the backstretch. I kept up the pace, running all out, but something happened as I got to the last turn. A quarter-mile race is once around the track. I go into the last turn, and I still believe to this day there was this huge bear that came out of the infield and jumped right on my back. And suddenly, everything in that race changed. I could barely move. I felt like I was running in mud. And my energy, I could feel it draining out of me. And as I came out of the last turn for the finish line, I should have been sprinting for the finish line, but I couldn't even see the finish line. My vision was so blurred. My heart was pounding out of my chest. My brain was screaming at me to quit. And I began to weave, and I began to stumble, and I literally fell as I crossed the finish line. And I came in dead last. And I was never more exhausted and disappointed and embarrassed. I tried hard, but trying wasn't enough. I was not prepared to run that race, and I didn't run it well, and I didn't finish it well. Now, the ministry is not the same thing as running a race, but it's a lot like running a race. And that's what the Apostle Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. When he is defending his own ministry, he describes his ministry as a race. Look at verses 24 to 27. He says this, "Do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one receives a prize? So run that you may obtain it. Every athlete exercises self-control in all things. They do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we do it for an imperishable one. So I do not run aimlessly. I do not box as one beating the air, but I discipline my body and keep it under control, lest after preaching to others, I myself should be disqualified." This past February, a pastor friend of mine that I've had the privilege of mentoring for many years when he was at our church, before he went down to Austin, he sent me an email and asked me if I would be willing to share with him what I've learned over the years in ministry that would help him as he spoke to about 200 men and women who were all starting out in ministry. He said, "Bill, I don't know anybody who's run the race better than you." And so, and I was, encouraged, but not deceived. And I knew what he wanted. He wanted something from me. But anyway, he said, "Could you share with me some things that you've learned that would help these young men and women run well and finish well?" And I was on a mission trip out of the country at the time, but on my way home, on the flight home, I was able to sit down and just reflect on 4 decades of ministry. And it was a great time for me. I don't even know who else was on the plane. I was just so absorbed in thinking about that. And by the time we landed, I had written down over 25 very important lessons that I had learned. And I know some of you are starting to tense up right now because Pastor Joe asked me if I would be willing to share all 25 with you, but I'm not going to do that. We all want to go to lunch here in a little bit. But the things I do want to share with you are not things that you haven't heard before, read before, or maybe even experienced before. But if you embrace them, they will help you go the distance. And if you don't, you may not make it because you're going to need them all. One of the things I learned in that first race I just talked about, and I've learned over 40 plus years of pastoral ministry, is what the Apostle Paul is telling us in this passage in 1 Corinthians 9 about running the race. And it's this: running the ministry race is not about trying harder. It's about training wisely. And so never stop training. I'm very thankful for the time I had here at DTS, both times. I was given tools to help me understand how to study and apply and teach the Word of God. I was given a solid foundation theologically and biblically. I was given kind of a framework for ministry as I started out, but it didn't complete my training by a long shot. In fact, it's interesting that the Apostle Paul gives that he gives this same ministry priority to his young pastor Timothy in 1 Timothy chapter 4, verses 7 and 8. Listen to what he says. He says, train for godliness. Train for godliness. For while bodily training is of some value, godliness is of value in every way, as it holds promise for the life present and also for the life to come. It's important for us to take care of ourselves, both physically, emotionally. It's important for us to continue developing our knowledge and our skills. But godliness training is more important. It's more important than any and all of that, because your life, your ministry, over the long haul will be more about your character than it will be about your competence, about your ability and your skills, or even your giftedness. It's more about your character. Godliness training is about passionately pursuing your relationship with Jesus Christ and not neglecting that. That's why you came into the ministry in the first place. That's why you're preparing in the first place, is because of your relationship with Jesus Christ. And the truth is, if you want others to grow deeper in their relationship with Christ, you must grow deeper. If you want others to passionately love Christ, you must passionately love Christ. And I say that, you know that, you've heard that. I say that because when you get in the ministry, and some of you are in it now here at the seminary, you know what I'm talking about. Life is busy. Ministry is tough. There is a lot coming at you, just like there is for those of you who are students. There is a lot coming at you, and this time of the semester you're probably getting a little worn out. And you may be kind of neglecting some things in order to get other things done. You think, I can't wait till I get out of here, then I can read what I want to read when I want to read. I can walk with God because I want to walk with God, not because my professor is telling me I need to. I'm telling you, it's so easy to neglect the most important thing, and that is your godliness training. Godliness training is about being conformed and transformed into the image of Jesus Christ. That's how God defines it. And we can never stop training for godliness. In your ministry, secondly, I would say exalt Christ, not yourself. Paul states that in Colossians 1, verse 15 to 18. He reminds us of who this is really all about, doesn't he? He said, He, Christ, is the image of the invisible God. He is the firstborn of all creation. For by him all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things were created through him, and all things were created for him. And he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And he is the head of the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead. And here's why. So that in everything he might have preeminence. The ministry God is calling you into, or that you are currently in, is not really about you. We heard Rick Warren make that famous in his book. It's not about you. It's not about your giftedness. It's not about your success in ministry. It's about exalting Christ. And in order to exalt Christ and do it well, you have to intentionally resist exalting yourself, because that's our default mode. Our default mode as selfish human beings is to self-protect and self-promote. And if we're not intentionally about exalting Christ, we will unconsciously or subtly try to exalt ourselves. And one of the things that might help you is this, and it's helped me years ago. I had to learn this early. Don't rely on the praise of others to keep you going. We all need encouragement, but we can't afford to feed on it. Because if you do, whatever you get won't be enough. And it will drive you to manipulate people and do things to try to get praise from others, instead of deflecting that and giving praise to God and exalting Christ. And that means also every day we have to check our egos at the door. In every meeting, in every sermon, we need to check our egos at the door. Follow Christ, serve Christ, preach Christ, promote Christ, exalt Christ, not yourself. I was at a pastor's luncheon a couple of years ago, and it was the first time I'd ever gotten to meet. I'd met these pastors, most of them, but I had never really had lunch with any of them, spent any time with them. And so we were just having lunch together, and it was a great time, but maybe I was a little self-conscious, a little nervous, I don't know. But there were two interns that were there with one of the pastors. And so one of the other pastors, before we left, said, hey, before we go, why don't we go around the room and share with these two young guys that are just starting out things that we've learned over the years, maybe one thing we've learned over the years that we wish we would have paid attention to early or known about early. And honestly, guys, I was thinking, what can I possibly say that would impress these other pastors? And I couldn't come up with a thing in my head. And the pressure was mounting because they were going one by one around the room, and it was coming up to my turn. And it was like God in that moment was humbling me. And I said to them, I looked at those two guys and I said, I wish I would have learned earlier, and I wish I would remember it today in this moment to stay humble, or God will humble you. And honestly, at the moment I shared that, even though I knew it was true, I was thinking, that sounded so lame. Those other pastors aren't impressed with that. Really, Bill, you couldn't come up with anything better than that? And as I've thought about it since, I can't come up with anything better than that. That is one of the most important things for ministry. Stay humble, or God will humble you. And I've been on both sides of that. I'm sure we all have. Leave it to the once proud, self-promoting disciple Peter to give us this warning. 1 Peter 5:5-7. He says, clothe yourselves, all of you, with humility towards one another. For God opposes the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. Humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, so that at the proper time he may exalt you, casting all your anxieties on him because he cares for you. Peter's not the only one that gives us that counsel. Paul gave us the same counsel. James gives us the same counsel. And here it is. God opposes the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. And if you've been in ministry at all or very long, you know that ministry is hard enough that you don't need God opposing you. What we all need, what we all want, is God's grace. That's what we need most. And so one of the ways that we access the grace of God, according to the Apostle Peter and Paul and James, is to just go ahead, take the initiative, and humble ourselves. And that means every day, humble yourself, or God will humble you. What I've experienced in ministry is when I've lived and served out of humility, the ministry is not only more effective, but it's more enjoyable. And it's a lot less painful because God's not opposing me. He's giving grace to me. And I've experienced, back in 92, I told you earlier that I almost got fired one time. And back in 92, right as I was finishing my D-Min degree here at Dallas Seminary, our church went through a leadership split. And some of it had nothing to do with me, but some of it was a failure of my leadership. And some of that was about my pride. And God humbled me. And you know what? At that time, I was ready to walk away, and I thought I will never be able to be effective in ministry again. And if that wouldn't have happened to me, I don't know if I'd still be in ministry. God humbled me greatly. But I became, as a result of that, he did some pruning in my life, and I became a better pastor. And so I've experienced this on both sides of it. And so I want to encourage you that we have to consciously, continually humble ourselves, because our default mode is to be prideful. A fourth thing that I've learned over the years is a constant reminder to love people, don't use people. Remember Jesus' command, John 13, 34 and 35? Remember that? Jesus says, by this, he says, love one another as I have loved you. This is a new commandment I give you, that you love one another. By this all men will know that you're my disciples, if you have love for one another. I mean, we're commanded to love one another. And as ministers of the gospel, we're commanded to love people. We're commanded to love people. And what does that look like day to day? What does that look like? Well, it looks like this. Love is patient and kind. Love does not envy or boast. It is not arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable. It is not resentful. It does not rejoice in wrongdoing, but it rejoices with the truth. It bears all things. It believes all things. It hopes all things. It endures all things. We're commanded to love people, not use people, not to manipulate people, not to try to get them to love us or feed our egos or make us feel better about ourselves. People know the difference, don't they? They know the difference when you love them selflessly, sacrificially, or when you're using them in some way. They can feel it, and they know it. I have found this over time, that love gives you the greatest equity for ministry. If people know you love them, they will follow your lead because they trust you. If people know you love them, they will listen to you when you have to say some hard things that they don't want to hear. When people know you love them, they will forgive you when you make mistakes, and you're going to make some. Loving people builds the greatest relational equity for our ministry to people. If you want to go the distance, I think we all know you got to run with endurance. Ministry's hard work. Don't expect it to be easy. It's going to bring a lot of joy, a lot of blessing, but it's also going to be filled with a lot of sorrow, a lot of pain. It will sap your energy. It will deplete your reserves. People will criticize you. They will disappoint you. They will turn on you. And if you don't develop endurance, you'll never make it to the finish line. That's why James teaches us a lot about that in his letter. That's the way he starts it, right? And he tells us that endurance means bearing up under the load. That's what the word hupomone means, right? It means to bear up under the load, not get out from under it. And that's our tendency. When we're under pressure, our first response is to want to get out from under that pressure as quickly as we can, any way we can. And yet, persevering is part of the ministry. It's part of the ministry. When things get hard and you get tired and you want to give up or you want to quit, don't. Remain under the weight. Don't try to escape it or run from it. Bear up under it. And sometimes, honestly, for me, that just meant showing up every day. I can remember a lot of mornings before daylight walking to the church, walking from the parking lot into the building when I was preaching, and I'm going, Lord, I got nothing today. How much longer do you want me to do this? But then they sing the song, during the offering, and you're up. And it doesn't matter how you feel. And God will use His word. I can't tell you how many times that I thought I struck out. And then some person, some individual would come up to me and tell me how God had convicted them or blessed them in some way. Have y'all experienced that? I mean, those of you who've ever preached know that. I mean, you're going to hit a single sometimes, a double, a triple. Rarely will you hit a home run, unless you're Chuck Swindoll. But it's really not about you. It is about showing up every day, no matter what. And that's what running with endurance involves. Fixing our eyes on Jesus, not ourselves. You're going to experience a lot of pressure to be successful. And some of that pressure is going to come in from the inside, and some of it's going to be put on you. The problem is too many people, including you, will tend to use wrong measurements to measure success. We are so prone to this. If you don't recognize this early and fight it early, you'll be driven by it. I know in my life I always wanted to really be good at something. I think we all kind of want that, right? You want to excel. You want to be really good at something. And I really was consciously wanting to be great at just one thing. But honestly, I was an average student with average intelligence. I was an average athlete, even though the older I get, the better I was in my own mind. But I was just average. And I'm an average preacher. And that's why none of you have ever heard of me. But what I have learned over the years is that ministry is really more about faithfulness than it is giftedness. And you need to know that. And you need to remember that. Or you won't last, because there is a lot of pressure out there to define success the way the world defines it. And Satan is the accuser of the brethren and sistren, if that's a word. And he loves to discourage us. He loves to tell us we're not good enough. First Corinthians 4:2, remember that passage? Very short verse, we ought to all know that one. It's required of a steward that he be found gifted? No. Smart? No. It's required of a steward that he be found what? Faithful. Just go back and read Jesus' parable in Matthew 25, the parable of the talents. Don't worry about whether you've been given little or much. Just be faithful with what you've been given. And then just maybe you'll hear the master say one day, well done, good and faithful servant. Now, finally, whether you know it or not, whether you want to admit it or not, we are all in succession. All of us. In fact, the race that we're running is not an individual race. It's a relay race. In Matthew 28, Jesus lets us know that our mission is about multicultural, multi-generational multiplication until the end of the age, until he returns. And so you're going to have the baton in your hand to run the race that God's called you to run. But at some point, you're going to have to hand that baton off to someone else. And my encouragement to you is to plan for that. Even at the beginning, start planning for it. 10 years ago, 2009, I came away from a sabbatical, came back to the church, had my first elders meeting. And typically what we do is we sit down with the elders, and when we come back from a sabbatical and we say, here's what God did in my heart, here's some of the things I'm thinking and about, the next 7 years or whatever. And I share with those guys, you know what? We need to start right now preparing and planning for my transition. And they're looking at me like, what? Are you resigning? And I said, no, I'm not ready yet. I think God still wants me to keep doing what I'm doing, but it's inevitable. I've been here 30 years. It's inevitable that we prepare that this is going to happen, and we need to start thinking about it. So 10 years ago, the elders and I, behind the scenes, began reading on all the books about succession and transition. We began to interact with pastors who had gone through it or were going through it, and pastors who have succeeded them. We brought them in. We had meetings, and one meeting in my house about it, and met with two pastors, brought them in from Arizona. We were learning and preparing and planning for 10 years behind the scenes. The church, the staff didn't know anything about that, but we were preparing for it. And there was a guy on our staff that I hired from AT&T, out of the business world, and he was doing a great job and growing, and he started giving him opportunities to preach, and he was doing a fantastic job in preaching. And so I began to give him more and more responsibilities, and he was on our short list. And about 4 years ago, he kind of moved up to the top of the list, and we began a mentoring process without him even knowing it. And then last summer, we approached him and went through a process of interfacing with him and interacting with him about this job. And this past January, we announced to our congregation that on May 19th of this year, after serving in my role for 40 years as a senior pastor, that we would be transitioning that role to another guy. And as you can imagine, whenever you first announced that, the congregation was shocked by it. And it wasn't because there was something wrong, and that's what everybody immediately thinks, right? It's because everything was right. It's because the church was healthy, strong. The elders and staff were unified and hitting on all cylinders. It was because we had the guy in place. They just didn't know it yet. And so on that day, when we announced my transition, we also announced who was going to replace me. When I announced that I was stepping down in May, you could hear people just... But when we announced who was going to replace me, everybody just relaxed. There was a standing ovation in the congregation, which was amazing. We were so grateful. And we announced that Scott Stonehouse, who prayed for us this morning, is going to be the next senior pastor of Woodcreek Church. And it's pretty exciting. Very exciting. Scott and Nicole, I married them 20 years ago. Was it 20? Yeah. Wow, 20 years ago, and hired him out of AT&T. He was at our church and to come be on our staff. And so he's been on our staff for 8 years. And as I said earlier, for the last 4 years, we've been mentoring him for this role. And the last year, he's been gearing up for it. And the people in the church know him and love him and are embracing him and embracing this change. And we're all excited about the next leg of the race for him and for this church and for Carol and I. Honestly, I got to stop. But when I look back on my ministry, my years as a pastor, I made a lot of mistakes. And guess what? You're going to make some too. It's inevitable. I wish I could have accomplished more. I wish I would have used my time more wisely. Honestly, early on, I was more of a Sabbath breaker than a Sabbath keeper, and I almost burned out a couple of times because of it. I wish I'd have been more courageous and risked more. There are things that I know now I wish I knew then, and if I got to do them over again, I would do them differently. But in it all and through it all, I tried to be faithful. And now I'm near the finish line. Now, Carol and I are going to keep serving Jesus till our last breath. We have a lot of things that God still wants us to do. We're still going to be at the church and still going to be serving. I'm going to join the parking team the Sunday after I step down. But as I get close to the finish line, what I'm thankful for is God's faithfulness. And what I'm thankful for and grateful for is that He answered the prayer. I'm thankful that He answered the prayer I prayed all the way back. And allow me to be in one place of ministry for this long. We have deep relationships with people. And we have walked in. This summer, I will be doing 2 weddings of gals in our church where I married their parents. And now I'm going to marry them. And I was at the hospital when they were born. That's what I prayed for. That's what God allowed me to do. And I want to encourage you to pray a similar prayer. In a real sense, I'm finishing the race some of you are starting, and I can tell you that it goes by really fast. You're the next generation of the pastors and leaders of the Church of Jesus Christ. And very soon, some of you are going to burst out of the starting blocks. Never stop training. Exalt Christ, not yourself. Stay humble, or God will humble you. Love people. Don't use them. Run with endurance. Be faithful. And when it's your time, make a clean handle. All for the glory of God. Let's pray. Oh God, from my youth you have taught me, and still I proclaim your wondrous deeds. So even to old age and gray hairs, which I now have, oh God, do not forsake me until I proclaim your might to another generation, your power to all those to come. Thank you for David's prayer in Psalm 71, Lord. I pray that all of us will join him in that prayer. Help us to run well. Help us finish well for the glory of God. Amen.